Well, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Levy Economics Institute and to the 11th summer seminar. We usually choose June because it's a good weather. We apologize for the weather that we hope will turn much better. And if it doesn't, you can blame Randy. I didn't have anything to do with it. If it's a good weather, then you can actually praise me. We want to share with you, first of all, that in this building that you are situated, we wanted to impress you by the augustness of the building. But of course, what I want to show you specifically, not really how good this building is and how beautiful it is, but basically saying something doesn't work here. Oh, here it is. Okay. But the fact that there's a known individual called FDR who appears in this picture right in the portico. But the most important thing is that FDR was a trustee of Bard College before he ran to be the governor of the state of New York. I want to first and foremost, to acknowledge and thank him profusely, Eric Brion, for making this seminar possible. Also, I want to thank him for his interest in the Institute's research and policy programs. Acknowledgement has to be made also to Randy Ray, who put this program together, and also the people who work behind the scenes, Michael Stevens, Liz Dunn, and Emily Angeveri. I also want, of course, to acknowledge the faculty, because some of them have come from disparate places all over Europe and Latin America, which is actually quite important. Now, what is it that we do here, and how did we come about? We were created in 1986 through the generosity of an individual who cared deeply about the economy, and there was some affiliation in the kinds of work that we were interested, having been trained in heterodox schools. It's a non-profit, non-partisan public policy research organization. Hyman Minsky and Wynne Godley were distinguished scholars here who created and actually, what I would say, form the intellectual foundations of the Institute. We have about 10 resident scholars. We have many research associates throughout the world. We have over 1,800 applications so far. There's 1.3 million page views per month, and 180,000 unique sessions. Now, then we also, many more hits that people sort of inquire about what we do, but don't necessarily download. And these are over 2 million. And we have 2 graduate degrees, the MS and the MA degree in economic theory and policy. What are the research programs that we have? Well, clearly the fiscal and monetary policy and central banking is a pinnacle of what it is that we do, and modern monetary theory and policy. We also track the US and world economies through models that we have created. See the Limus there is the Levy Institute model for United States. The LIMG is the Levy Institute for Greece. And also we have a similar model for Italy. These are the stock flow models, which you will hear more about it. The other area of research is labor markets and full employment. and specifically the active labor markets and the job guarantee. We also have gender equality program and the distribution of income and wealth and time. Now, as a result of the distribution of income, we have developed a number of measures. The measure of economic well-being, the measure of time and income poverty. Usually when we talk about poverty, we don't talk about income poverty, but there's a question of time poverty. And that is difficult for people to understand. But one thing you should know is there is a question of time. A lot of people that may be wealthy in income, but very poor in terms of time. And then the next thing is the, again, Levy Institute measure of time, income, and consumption, which is, again, another measure that tells us the well-being of individuals, especially if one looks at it in terms of along gender lines. Now, before I move to others, I have a few more slides. I want to talk a little bit about Hyman Minsky. Hyman Minsky was an individual who, as most of us say, and Randy specifically wrote a book about him, that he was a maverick economist. He graduated from the University of Chicago in mathematics, but gravitated towards economics, and also held degrees from Harvard, a PhD from Harvard. He had many acquaintances, and he was very comfortable in talking to both orthodox and heterodox economists. But primarily, the ideas that he came up with they were more in the heterodoxy. He had a long-lasting friendship and research relationship with Abba Lerner. Now, Abba Lerner is an important figure. You will hear more about him. Abba Lerner is known for his work on economics of control, distributive efficiency, and he was the inventor of the NARO. All of you know what NARO is, an accelerated inflation rate of unemployment. But he was also known for his work on chartalism and the principle of functional finance, government expenditure, government financing for purposeful expenditure. Now, Randy Ray, Pavlina Terneva, and others will analyze both of these concepts, Randy on chartalism and Pavlina on functional finance, and their relationship to modern monetary theory. Minsky was influenced very much from Joseph Schumpeter. He was his dissertation advisor. And if one looks at Minsky's research, one will see the influence that Schumpeter had on Minsky's research, because the connection of innovation and creative destruction. Now, Minsky held teaching appointments, first at Brown University, then at UC Berkeley, and then at Washington University in St. Louis, where Randy Ray was one of his dissertation students, before he finally came here to the Institute in the beginning of the 1990s. Now, as I said earlier, he was very comfortable with orthodox and heterodox economists, and every economist knows about Minsky and specifically about his financial instability hypothesis. His research and writing on financial and economic instability contain both theoretical and empirical aspects, and they are reflected in his journal articles, which are many, as well as his three most important books. He discovered that in capitalist economies, there exists an inherent generation of instability that results in a financial crisis accompanied by debt deflation that can potentially spiral out of control. Minsky was a strong advocate of a big government as a stabilizer of the economy and a big bank the central bank, acting as a lender of last resort. And he led our efforts here at the Institute in the 1990s to kill the rebalanced budget amendment that was proposed by the Republican Senate during the Clinton administration. As we all know by now, historical episodes, and primarily the Great Depression or the Great Breakdown, as Minsky used to call it, the Asian crisis and the Great Recession of 2007-2008, proved the ineptness of the government. Analyzing the Great Breakdown, Minsky determined the economic conditions that would allow such a situation to happen again. The theoretical basis of the financial instability hypothesis draws from Keynes, who identified the problem of achieving the capital development of the economy. And capital development, as Keynes and Minsky understood, involved financial relations and exchanges of present money for future money. His analysis of financial relations and their implications for the financial system's behavior was not restricted to the liability structure of business and their cash flows, and you will hear more about the importance of cash flows, but also included household and government debt and the international sector, which the economy's performance could either validate or not validate. This is in direct relation to Wynne Godley, another distinguished scholar that I will talk a little bit at the end about. Wynne Godley's model of financial balances, as you will hear more about it. To Minsky, how investment was financed was important, in contrast to the conventional theory that we know from Modigliani and Miller, that argues that in a competitive market, there is no distinction between the types of finance that takes place, whether the finance is internal, borrowing, or equity. But Minsky contended that it was important how finance takes place. And he also suggested that economic stability is unattainable. He used to say to us that stability is destabilizing, and offered a set of policy to deal with that. There were policy recommendations which will help mitigate the extent of instability. He was well aware of the ever-evolving financial innovation, which due to the ineptness of regulators becomes a driver for financial fragility. He was concerned with a number of issues, such as leverage, and that was actually taken from Keynes's theory of speculative excesses, as they were practiced in Wall Street, in the City of London, and in other financial markets, vis-a-vis the capital development of the real economy. He also was concerned about the level of leverage, and he had a taxonomy of financing profiles: hedge, speculative, and Ponzi. And the last one, it was the most dangerous one, because it actually helped sustain asset pricing bubbles up to the point that they burst. He also was concerned about shadow banking, what he called fringe banking. He was concerned about regulatory failure, the ineptness of the regulators, because he thought that businesses were more politically agile and powerful than the regulators who actually supervised them. And finally, he was also concerned about the too big to fail, the money center banks that when threatened with insolvency, they turned to government bailouts, not only for their own survival, but to prevent the financial system's meltdown. So precisely because they were too large, they required this government assistance that Minsky called contingency socialism. Now, Minsky's insights about the causes of instability and its manifestation to a crisis came to be known as a Minsky moment. The phrase Minsky moment or Minsky journey were coined by a PIMCO chief economist, Paul Macaulay, and he coined that when the Asian debt crisis of 1997 took place. It was also reappeared during the 2007-2008 financial crisis in a first-page Wall Street Journal article. Now, Minsky was also very much influenced by Michael Kalecki, and his financial instability hypothesis incorporates Kalecki's view on profits, which are dependent on the structure of the aggregate demand. More specifically, Kalecki's influence was based on the relations that profits flow to investment, government deficits lead to business profits, profits depend on the course of the balance of trade. Now, both Kalecki and Minsky believe that macroeconomic relations determine aggregate profits and that market power and technical conditions of producing determine the distribution of profits. Now, that again comes in contrast with the orthodox view that argues that both the mass and distribution of profits are determined by the technical conditions of production and the market structure, while government has no important role to play in increasing or stabilizing profits. Now, in a complex and sophisticated economy like the US or Europe, profit expectations are stabilized by policy measures that operate upon the inducement to invest, the financing of investment, the government deficit, the propensities to consume, and the foreign trade balance. If you incorporate all these relations, they yield a macroeconomic accounting identity on which the Levy Institute macro models are based, and we use to produce strategic analysis for the US and other economies. Some of these analyses are outside in the hall. If you're curious, you can take a look at them. Now, even though this macroeconomic identity is not a policy, it informs policy. Now, there are other things that Minsky was concerned, which had to do actually with the explosion of the shadow banking. So he was concerned about the safety and soundness of the payment system. He would be, for instance, very much concerned of the methods of payment that are used now, including cryptocurrency. He was disturbed by the increasing debt of the private sector and the financial layering with greater and greater leverage ratios, and he foresaw in 1987 the dramatic explosion of securitization and the likely consequences that we have witnessed. He was also instrumental in crafting the legislation, along with some of us, in dealing with the Community Development Financial Institutions Act in an effort to eliminate fringe banking and provide banking services to the unbanked. In his last years, he was very much concerned with the transformation of the economic system from industrial capitalism to a finance-guided one, which he called money manager capitalism, and which he considered to be very unstable. Eric Timon will talk more about this in his talk next day. Another important issue, perhaps one of the most important issues, was the attainment of full employment. And he insisted that full employment to be the answer in ameliorating poverty to a large extent. He restated his 1965 idea of an employer of last resort, ELR, which led to many Levy Institute publications. He convinces all of the significance of this policy being the only active labor market policy that can solve the problem of unemployment, as opposed to the policies of wage subsidies and work share programs. The ELR, or Guarantee Employment Policy, has been implemented in Argentina, South Africa, Greece, and elsewhere, and you will hear more about them and their implementations by Rania Antonopoulos, Pavlina Cherneva, Sandy Darity, and Derek Hamilton. Now, an extension of Minsky's work is the modern monetary theory, as Randy will document on this connection. And with modern monetary theory, there are significant implications to government deficits and funding a job guarantee policies. Now, Warren Mosler, individual who was a hedge fund manager, visited the Institute in 1997. And he argued for a new approach to money, which led Randy to write his first book on MMT, Understanding Modern Money, that appeared in 1998. In my judgment, this is how I believe the modern monetary theory, MMT, what we call it, began to gain currency. Warren's and Randy's original work that was followed by more work and refinements by Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, Pavlina, and others who are here, and you will hear from them. And they all were able to place MMT in where it is now. There will be many of these talks, and they will analyze various aspects of MMT. They analyze money from a historical perspective. They will include chattelism, state money, and the power of sovereign money with far-reaching implications for monetary and fiscal policy. Without preempting the contributions of my colleagues that will follow, let me only point out that MMT is not what its opponents, spearheaded by some guy named Larry Summers, claims it to be. It is not just printing money and deficit spending. Economists and people in government have embraced MMT for a reason. And most importantly, as most presentations will show, MMT has nothing to do with either the price level increases that we are currently experiencing all over the world or the threat of the oncoming recession. Finally, I want to say a few words about Wynne Godley, whose work has contributed very significantly to the intellectual foundation of this institute. Now, Wynne Godley, as you can see, joined in 1994, and he uses this model that he developed in Cambridge, which uses the three financial balances. The private sector, the public sector, as well as the external sector. With another individual, a research scholar here, Gennaro Zeza, whom you will hear from on Wednesday, he constructed the Levy Institute's US stock flow model, which tracked basically the paths of the three balances. And on the basis of these and the policies that would be implicated, it would be applied for projecting the intermediate run, he came out to see what actually will happen within 2 or 3 years. And seeing those balances in the late 1990s, he determined that this cannot continue, and therefore he warned of the coming recession in 2001 as well as in 2007. Now, this is a macroeconomic identity, and you can see it's basically a Keynesian identity that combines both, as I said, the private sector, the public sector, and the external sector. Now, let me just say before I go to this, given that the private sector, from various research that's been done, specifically by Ruggles and Ruggles, it's usually in surplus, and the current account, especially for the US, is in deficit. A government deficit as a result of this macroeconomic identity must be a necessity. Now, in the case that the public sector is biased towards surplus, clearly the private sector has to alter its behavior in order to have this macroeconomic identity hold, which means that the demand will fall. And that is a problem in terms of a recession that will follow. Now, Godley warned that these sectors, the balances that were being developed in these sectors were not something that could continue forever, unless there's an appropriate action to reverse it. And what's the appropriate action? Well, of course, a public fiscal policy expansion. The culmination of this work, as I said, has spurred actually a lot of activity, not only at the Levy Institute, but worldwide in developing this stock flow consistent modeling. Now, using the same principle of these three balances, Godley most emphatically pointed out the serious flaws of the Euro project and the arbitrary rules of the Maastricht Treaty. And this is what he had to say: that if Europe is not to have a full-scale budget of its own under the new arrangements of the Maastricht Treaty, it will still have by default a fiscal stand of its own made up of individual budgets of component states. You know, in the euro, we have a unified monetary policy, but a separate national fiscal policy. And this will be the result. The danger then is that the budgetary restraint and so forth and so on, that at the end, a depression will come about, and no one will be able to lift the recession, and that will come. And we saw this that happened in the 2008, 2009 crisis, and still is to some extent continuing to some member states in Europe. Now, let me end by saying that our research and policy work will continue to draw from Minsky and Godley, because these are the intellectual foundations of the Institute, and also specifically in the extension to MMT. We seek to develop a better understanding of the operation and complexity of monetary and fiscal policies in modern capitalist economies. And we hope that you will experience the rigor and depth of the analysis of the presentations that you will hear in this seminar. Now, I want to point out that each presentation, of course, represents a particular perspective, which may not be agreeable to all, but it is fruitful for you, nevertheless, to become familiar and consider the differences. I invite you to explore the Institute's website to learn more about our work and our research, both in theory and policy, and especially to take some time to search in the Minsky archive. As of the end of May, there have been over 100,000 downloads of his various writings and correspondence. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I want to call on my colleague, Stephanie Kelton, to take the podium.